On the 5th of July 1601, Archduke Albert gave the order, and the air above Ostend erupted in thunder. 50 massive field guns roared, shaking the dunes of Flanders to their core, while 12,000 Spanish soldiers surged forward, intent on bringing the city to its knees. Little did they know that this was only the opening act of a merciless war of attrition, a siege that would grind on for more than 3 relentless years. The siege of Ostend was one of the longest and bloodiest in history. Contemporaries even refer to it as the New Troy, evoking the legendary siege. All of Europe was captivated by the events, and hundreds of onlookers traveled to the coast of Flanders to witness the spectacle firsthand. Some even ventured into the city to watch the action up close. And there was indeed much to see. Ostend saw siege engines that the world had never witnessed before. And an Italian strategist demonstrated that bookworms should never be underestimated. This is how modern historiography tells the story of the staggering siege of Ostend. The Dutch enclave around Ostend was a thorn in Spain's side. As long as the Dutch Republic controlled the area, Archduke Albert, who ruled the Spanish Netherlands alongside his wife Isabella, was forced to wage war on his own soil and forgo one of the region's most important ports. On top of that, he feared that Maurice of Orange, the Captain General of the Republic's armed forces, might use Ostend as a bridgehead for a southern advance. Maurice had already led a campaign in that direction in 1600, dealing Albert a bruising defeat at the Battle of Newport, one of the few major field battles of the 80 Years' War. Determined to avenge this loss and eliminate the bridgehead threat once and for all, the Spanish regent set out in 1601 to capture the Dutch Republic's last stronghold in the south. Over the course of the previous century, Ostend had transformed from a humble fishing village of just 3,000 inhabitants into one of the region's most formidable military ports. By 1601, it was not only a thriving town, but also a powerful fortress, garrisoned by 4,500 men and shielded by extensive outworks. These outlying fortifications enclosed 2 rings of walls with massive bastions, each guarded by a marshy moat brimming with seawater. Ostend's defenses were formidable, but what made the city nearly impregnable was its location. Water surrounded it on all sides. To the north, the walls met the sea itself. To the east and west, 2 wide creeks hemmed in the bastions, the old harbor on the west and the new harbor on the east. To the south, the outworks stretched deep into tangled wetland, crisscrossed by dozens of small channels and streams. Only the sandy dunes remained dry, offering a place for heavy artillery. But even there, every attacker confronted the daunting prospect of crossing one of the 2 harbors at its widest point. Perhaps the greatest advantage for the defenders was that the city maintained a lifeline to Sealand and Holland through the new harbor called Geule, which roughly translates to gully. Throughout the siege, ships carrying reinforcements, food and ammunition, and other supplies reached Ostend through this route. Cutting it off was almost impossible. Shifting tides and treacherous sands made an approach from the east perilous. The Spanish Ravelin, a defensive fortification, loomed over the harbor, and the Dutch fleet ruled the sea. At times, the route was even considered safe enough to allow civilians, including women, to enter the city and witness the siege up close. The Spanish appeared outside Ostend on the 5th of July. Albert chose to attack from the southwest, the more accessible side of the city, even though it was heavily fortified. The approach was feasible, but clearing the defenders from their forward positions in the marshes would take time. At this point, Albert had no idea just how long the operation would drag on. as the first approach trenches inched toward the town, more and more soldiers poured into the Spanish camp. Soon, the garrison faced a vastly superior force of around 20,000 men. Despite the odds, Charles van der Noot, the city's military governor, ordered a sortie with just 1,000 men on the 12th of July to probe the Spanish positions. The attack revealed just how well Albert's troops had prepared. The garrison alone could not hope to dislodge them from their trenches. Van der Noot immediately wrote to the States General in The Hague, the supreme governing body of the Dutch Republic, requesting additional troops and urging them to reinforce his garrison to 8,000 men. Determined to hold Ostend, the Dutch acted swiftly, and the first reinforcements arrived only 3 days later. Accompanying the first troops to arrive was the man appointed by the States General to lead the defense, Sir Francis Vere. The seasoned English general had been chosen for 2 reasons. First, his presence in the city ensured that Queen Elizabeth I of England would not object to the deployment of English troops. Second, Vere was fiercely ambitious. By successfully defending Ostend, he hoped to surpass Maurice of Orange, the Dutch Republic's Captain General. Maurice was far from pleased with Vere's appointment, particularly when his rival requested additional troops for the defense, troops that had been pulled from the field army with which Maurice was besieging the town of Rheinberg. Nevertheless, the Captain General sent a requested 2,000 men to Ostend in mid-July. But when Vere requested another 2,000 men 2 weeks later, Maurice refused and told the States General that a choice had to be made. If he sent more troops to Ostend, his field army would no longer be operational. That left only 2 options. Either Vere received enough men to defend the city without outside help, or the field army was sufficiently reinforced to attack a key Spanish fortress, forcing Albert to abandon the siege. The second option would have required recruiting additional troops, a costly measure the States General did not want, so they rejected Maurice's recommendation and ordered him to send the additional 2,000 men to Ostend and return to The Hague. With these reinforcements, the garrison reached its intended strength of 8,000 men. Vere was tasked with deploying them to actively defend Ostend from its extensive outworks. The city was among the first in the Netherlands to boast more than simple ravelins and bastions, and the defenders now exploited this advantage to drag out the siege and bleed Spanish resources. Albert responded with cannonballs. The Spanish guns mercilessly pounded the outer defenses. On the 14th of August, during a particularly fierce bombardment, Vere was struck in the head. His men rushed him to the city center for treatment, but the injury was so severe that he had to be taken to Middelburg to recover. The loss of their leader threw the defense into crisis. With Vere out of action, the States General had no choice but to adopt the strategy Maurice had proposed. They sent Major Peter Sedlnitsky to Ostend to handle matters arising from Vere's absence, while Maurice was authorized to raise another 6,000 men and lay siege to 's-Hertogenbosch. At the same time, the States General was searching for a sustainable way to keep Ostend supplied with troops. It was estimated that the, quote, garrison would lose 1,000 men a month to death, wounds, and disease, end quote. Sending fresh recruits every month was logistically impossible, so they decided to rotate the troops, while maintaining an active garrison of 4,000 men. This strategy followed Maurice's recommendation. Unlike Vere, he believed the garrison should be no larger than necessary, as the autumn storms would soon make Ostend difficult or impossible to reach for weeks on end. A larger garrison, he argued, would burn through supplies far too quickly. In addition, Ostend was never designed to house such a large numbers of soldiers. Even with a garrison of 4,000 men, 30 to 50 men sometimes had to share a single room. In these overcrowded conditions, disease spread rapidly, and nearly every shot from the Spanish artillery found its mark. To address at least a part of the problem, the defenders built additional shelters in the outer works. To shield them from Spanish bombardment, they covered the shelters with a thick layer of earth. giving them a striking resemblance to the earth bunkers of the First World War. Albert's men were struggling as well. Bullets and disease were taking their toll. Morale was failing, and the soldiers from Italy and Spain, unaccustomed to Flanders' harsh climate, were suffering in the wet winter cold. Increasingly, men decided they could no longer endure these conditions and deserted. The Battle of Ostend had become a true war of attrition. On his return to Middelburg, Sedlnitsky met with Maurice and Vere to report his findings. In his assessment, Ostend could hold out for the time being, but the divisionary attack on 's-Hertogenbosch had to be launched without delay. After the meeting, Vere, now recovered from his injury, hurried back to Ostend, while Maurice traveled to The Hague to prepare the divisionary assault. A few weeks later, on the night of the 1st to the 2nd of November, the Captain General arrived at 's-Hertogenbosch with his cousin, William Ludwig, and some 13,000 men. Their army was too small to fully encircle the city, so they attempted to bring it to its knees with relentless bombardment, focusing on the residential areas in the hope of turning the population against the Spaniards. When no uprising materialized, and with the first frost of winter making digging trenches and constructing fortifications increasingly difficult, the cousins were forced to accept that nothing could be done. On the 26th of November, they called off the siege and sent their troops into winter quarters. Because the army of the Dutch Republic never posed a real threat to 's-Hertogenbosch, the Spaniards were able to continue the siege of Ostend without interruption. Their trenches soon reached the outworks on the southwest side, and a powerful battery dominated the western dunes, pounding at the sandhill bastion. According to Henry Hexham, an English military writer and captain, the cannonade was so violent that, quote, the work might rather have been called Iron Hill than Sandhill, for it was so stuck full of bullets that many of them tumbled down into the Fosse Bray. But Ostend's guns took their toll as well, killing many attackers. Soon the ground before the ramparts was, quote, strewn everywhere with arms, legs, and hands. Surgeons came out of the town and brought back bags full of human fat, which they had stripped from the bodies. End quote. As historian Christopher Duffy notes, this grisly material was a common ingredient in the preparation of ointments. On the 23rd of December, some soldiers brought a Spanish deserter to Vere. To Vere's horror, the man revealed that Albert was preparing a major assault with 6,000 to 7,000 men. The garrison could not hope to withstand such an onslaught. Winter storms had blocked supply ships from reaching the new harbor for weeks, leaving Vere's men hungry and exhausted. The outer works would surely fall under such pressure, yet he could not abandon them without a fight, because that would mean surrendering Ostend's first line of defense. At the last moment, the Englishman conceived a daring plan. 3 days later, Maurice of Orange could hardly believe his ears. The defenders of Ostend had invited 2 Spanish negotiators into the town and were discussing the city's surrender. Vere's explanation that it was a desperate ruse of war did little to reassure the Captain General, but the Englishman knew exactly what he was doing. As he had explained to his officers a few days earlier, he assured Maurice that the negotiations were intended only, quote, to amuse the enemy for a while, until he received help from the States General, end quote. In fact, Vere managed to prolong the talks masterfully. Shortly after they began, he sounded the alarm, even though no attack had occurred, and accused the Spanish of breaking the truce. Only after a 24-hour investigation did he admit his alleged mistake. To smooth things over, he then invited the negotiators to a Christmas banquet, which lasted most of the 25th of December. Vere's ruse was working better than anyone had expected, and the defenders breathed a sigh of relief when a ship carrying reinforcements finally arrived in the new harbor the next day. The Englishmen then immediately broke off the negotiations. The Archduke was seething with rage. Vere had violated the customs of war, and, even more infuriatingly, had outwitted him. Ostend would pay dearly for this audacity. At the turn of the year, a deafening cannonade rained down on the city. Hundreds of cannonballs smashed the poorly repaired defenses, paving the way for the Archduke's long-awaited retaliatory strike. On the 7th of January, after a delay of more than 2 weeks, he ordered a major assault. At low tide, shortly after dark, Spanish troops advanced from all sides, most moving through the old harbor in front of the sandhill bastion. They had no inkling that Vere had prepared a deadly trap for them. Under the cover of darkness, the Spaniards crossed the old harbor with almost no resistance. But as they neared the walls, a sharp command rang out, and hundreds of flaming rings arced over their heads, bathing them in a flickering, hellish light. Seconds later, a deadly volley from the defenders swept the first, brightly lit rank back into the trench. The second rank advanced immediately, but before the men came close, a spring tide surged from the right, sweeping many into the sea. The defenders had opened the sluices of the moat, transforming the accumulated water into a devastating weapon. Those who survived the torrent were scattered and defenseless, picked off one by one. The Spanish assault ended in utter disaster. Nearly 2,000 men perished in a single night. Ironically, this stunning defensive victory would become Vere's undoing. The ease with which Ostend had repelled the assault stood in stark contrast to his relentless calls for reinforcements. The States General began to question whether the Englishman was truly up to the task. In the spring of 1602, they summoned him to The Hague to explain himself. At the hearing, Vere became so entangled in contradictions that the decision was made to replace the garrison with 5,500 fresh troops and to replace Vere with Colonel Frederick van Dorp. Throughout the spring, the States General continued searching for a way to force the Spanish to abandon Ostend. At the end of June, they finally dispatched Maurice to Brabant. With the largest army the Republic had ever assembled, he was to invade Spanish territory from the east with some 19,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, aiming to surprise and destroy Albert's field army under Francisco de Mendoza. But logistical problems caused such severe delays that Maurice lost any hope of surprising the enemy. By the time he reached Sint-Truiden, the Spanish were already entrenched and had blocked the road to Brussels. Maurice tried to lure them into battle by deploying his troops in full formation, but Mendoza stayed behind his earth ramparts. It was hardly honorable, but brutally effective. The only way past would have been a costly siege. The Captain General was still searching for a way forward when supply problems forced him to retreat. Determined not to return home empty-handed, he besieged and captured the small fortress of Grave. Shortly afterward, the States General disbanded his army for financial reasons. Maurice's unsuccessful campaign made it painfully clear that the Dutch Republic lacked the resources to relieve Ostend. For the time being, the States General abandoned this strategy. A deadly yet fruitless routine settled over Ostend. For an entire year, the Spanish refrained from direct assaults, instead erecting a massive artillery platform in the dunes that unleashed a relentless hail of shot upon the city. When the summer of 1602 brought an unwelcome ally to the Spanish bombardment, the plague, the garrison's losses soared. Only the tireless efforts of the Republic's fleet, which constantly ferried fresh troops and supplies, kept Ostend alive for yet another harsh winter. At the beginning of April 1603, the weather turned into the Spaniards' favor. A violent storm swept across the coast, ravaging the seaward defenses. Archduke Albert seized the opportunity. His men drew the defenders' attention westward with a feigned attack on the old harbour, then hurled themselves with full force against the southern outworks. The garrison fought valiantly, but they were forced to abandon the outermost line, the so-called polder, and fall back to the ravelins and the main rampart behind it. The loss of the polder proved catastrophic. From there, the Spaniards could fire directly into the city centre. Once again, the defenders were crammed together, and there was scarcely a single place within the fortress safe from Spanish shot. Although Ostend came under immense pressure after this defeat, Albert was unable to make any further gains for the rest of 1603. The reason became painfully clear with every ship that reached the city. As long as the Republic enjoyed unrestricted access by sea, the fortress could not be starved into submission. To win, the Archduke would have to cut off the new harbour, but so far all his attempts had failed. Then, as if by providence, a gift arrived at his camp. The Pope dispatched one of his most studied engineers, a man named Pompeo Targone. Targone immediately set to work at his drawing board. His mission to push the approach trenches through the eastern dunes and seize the Spanish ravelin, whose guns dominated the new harbour. To achieve this, he devised all manner of remarkable contraptions. First came a massive gabion, which his men struggled in vain to roll toward the city. Next, he designed a floating artillery platform with heavy guns that successfully approached the walls, but was sunk by the defenders within minutes. Finally, he attempted a floating dike to block the harbour's entrance, which the first storm washed away. One by one, Targone's inventions failed spectacularly. The Spanish soldiers, still smarting from the deadly failures of Targone's experiments, were far from pleased when another Italian bookworm appeared in their camp shortly after. The young man was the scion of a wealthy Genoese banking family, well versed in the theory of war, but entirely lacking practical experience. The hardened veterans shuddered at the thought of what this greenhorn might attempt. The Archduke, however, took an immediate liking to him. The young officer not only waived his pay until Ostend fell, but his family even covered the cost of the ongoing siege. In October of 1603, Albert placed him in sole command. This bookworm was none other than Ambrogio Spinola, who would go on to become one of the greatest experts in siege warfare. The Spanish officers were stunned when the young man revealed himself as both an exceptional engineer and a charismatic leader. Spinola quickly earned the respect of the soldiers and considerably enhanced the morale in the camp. He proved to be, as Christopher Duffy writes, quote, the rarest of creatures, a man who had equipped himself to be a complete commander from the study of books, end quote. Spinola had learned in the library what others learned on the battlefield and paid for with the blood of their men, which is a reminder that sometimes books are the safest way to explore history, preferably from a comfortable chair with far fewer cannonballs involved. That idea actually inspired the coloring book we recently put together. Some of the illustrations you have seen in this video, like the Musketeer, Maurice of Orange, and a 17th century pikeman, are included in it, if you enjoy the artwork in these videos. This lets you take it off screen and interact with it yourself. The book also features scenes from other historical periods, including artwork tied to videos we haven't released yet. So there are a few small previews hidden inside. And unlike Ostend, it's a far less stressful way to spend an afternoon. Spinola considered an assault on the new harbour pointless. In his view, Ostend could only be brought to its knees by conquering the city metre by metre, gradually pushing the garrison ever further back. Such a formal siege would take time. and cost thousands of lives. But Spinola was a pragmatist. Even by just blockading the town, he was losing men every day. If they were to die, they should at least make their sacrifice count. The new commander ordered his troops to construct covered causeways, known as galleries, across the old harbor at several points. He divided the men by nationality: Germans, Spaniards, Italians, and Walloons, and turned the perilous work between the marshy harbor waters and the defenders' relentless fire into a competition of honor among nations. As the men painstakingly advanced, Targone's latest contraption was brought into play: a massive mobile siege ramp that the soldiers nicknamed the Hell Wagon. Over 30 meters long and mounted on 4 enormous wheels, it was hauled forward toward the walls by 40 horses and a system of pulleys. At first it seemed that Targone had finally created a functioning invention, but then a cannonball shattered one of the wheels, rendering the entire machine useless. Another of the engineer's devices had failed spectacularly. In the spring of 1604, Mother Nature once again asserted her power. A series of violent storms disabled parts of the defenses, which the Spaniards took advantage of by capturing the small polder bulwark. Shortly thereafter, after nearly 5 months of grueling labor, the Walloon gallery finally reached the outer wall. Hundreds of men surged across the covered causeways, scaled the ramparts, and took possession of the great polder bulwark and the western ravelin. With the outermost fortifications now in his hands, Spinola was free to launch the assault on the city's first ring of walls. When the defenders saw their first line of fortifications fall, they set to work constructing new ramparts and a final refuge. They named their last resort New Troy, in reference to the legendary city said to have withstood a decade-long siege. In this case, however, the name was far from prophetic. With too little earth available, the defenders had to improvise. They built the ramparts from rubble, soil, and the lifeless bodies of their fallen comrades. The result must have been a terrifying sight. Back in The Hague, concern over Ostend was growing. Day by day, it became clearer that the city's fall was only a matter of time, and the question soon arose of how much longer they should continue investing in a city that might already be lost. Tens of thousands had already perished, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to find men willing to serve in Ostend. Strategically, the time had come for damage control, and to find a replacement for the battered port. The Republic needed a stronghold in the south, which is why the States General turned their attention to the well-fortified inland port of Sluis. On the 23rd of May, Maurice marched to the city with 19,000 men and began the siege. Thus began a race against time. Could the Captain General secure the port before the old one fell? The defenders of Ostend fought with fierce determination, but their strength was waning. When the Spaniards detonated a mine beneath Porcupine Ravelin on the 29th of May, the garrison could not withstand the subsequent assault. About a month later, on the 17th of June, the next advance struck. This time against 2 sections of the main wall. The defenders threw themselves into the fight with their last ounce of strength, and a desperate melee erupted. Men stabbed and slashed at one another, some with the butts of their muskets, others with clubs ripped from the defenses, and still others with their bare hands. Against all odds, the exhausted garrison held the western wall. But the southwestern bulwark was lost. The Spanish pressed forward relentlessly. Even the reinforcements that arrived on the 22nd of July could not stem their advance. After these victories, Spinola grew increasingly confident that Ostend would eventually fall. He resolved to try to relieve Sluis, hoping to deliver a double blow to the Republic. On the 25th of July, he led 8,000 men against the besiegers, only to be repelled by Maurice's formidable circumvallation. After that, he tried to seize Cadzand to disrupt the Dutch field army's connection to Zeeland. But this too failed. When Sluis finally yielded to Maurice on the 20th of August, the Republic breathed a collective sigh of relief. The States General tried one last time to relieve Ostend, but it was painfully clear that all hope was lost. On the 22nd of August, the weather gods sided with the Spaniards for the third time. An unusually violent storm for the season tore through the city, washing away large sections of New Troy. Just under a month later, the Spanish overran the Helmont Bulwark and the Sandhill Bastion. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The defenders were forced to retreat to their final refuge. But the battered ramparts offered scant protection, and the city's last governor, Daniel de Hurtain, made the fateful decision to surrender only after a few days. Ostend fell on the 20th of September 1604. The beaches of Flanders had become the stage for one of the longest and bloodiest sieges in history. When Archduke Albert and his wife Isabella arrived to inspect the conquered city, they found a shattered, ghostly ruin. The battle for the fortress had cost Spain some 40,000 men, closer to the toll of a full-scale war than a single siege. Albert had achieved his goal of eliminating the Dutch Republic's last stronghold in the southern Netherlands, but at a staggering cost.